The Rangers have fired Chris Woodward after winning a series against the Mariners in the middle of a season that was not supposed to be a winning season. What the heck was the reasoning for it? And what the heck is going to come next? All that and more on this episode of Locked On Rangers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On to the Texas Rangers. I'm Bryce Patrick, a cripplingly addicted Texas Rangers fan since 2010, founder and host for all 4 seasons of this Locked On Rangers podcast. Today, it's still Monday, August 15th. Your Rangers are still 51-83. Thank you all so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen and your second listen, apparently, today, every single day. If you're not already, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Bryce Patrick. You can follow the show at Locked On Rangers and subscribe on YouTube, where the best way you could help grow the show is to comment everything below. Comment who you think the Rangers' next manager should be, who you think what the Rangers should have done instead of this. But I'm recording this literally 2 hours after I put out my last episode, because within 5 minutes of me putting out my early episode today, the Rangers announced that they have fired Chris Woodward after a winning series, the first series they have won all year against the Mariners, who have absolutely destroyed them. Jeff, the rally pigeon, could not save Chris Woodward's job. The Rangers are moving on from their manager today, and it is announced that Tony Beasley will serve as interim manager until the Rangers hire someone else. Maybe it'll be throughout the end of the season. I don't know. I like that part of it. That is the only part of this that I like. This is a confusing move, doing this in the middle of the year. The Rangers were not expected to be competitive this year. They talked about wanting to be competitive, wanting to be good, wanting to make that next step this year, and everyone thought, okay, you did add a lot on the payroll, which, by the way, when people talk about the Rangers spending $500 million, they didn't spend $500 million on this year's team. They don't have a $500 million payroll. They were coming from literally nothing, and they spent that out over the next 10 seasons. So there was still a lot of holes to fix on this team. They couldn't do it in one off season. They were meant to be competitive this year. They've shown they're a better team than their record. They have a Pythagorean record of 57-57, which means they should probably be about 500, if not for some horrendous one-run game bad luck. They have scored 511 runs this year. They allowed 513, and this after 4 seasons at the helm, Chris Woodward is no longer in charge. 114 games this year, only 51 wins. For his career as a skipper, he has a 42.4 win percentage. He was 2 games shy of managing 500 games for this club, and I don't understand why. This is what John Daniels had to say in a written statement about this decision. He said, quote, "Chris Young and I had the very difficult task of informing Chris Woodward of our decision today. In his tenure as the Rangers manager, Chris Woodward worked tirelessly under what was at sometimes difficult circumstances. He has been dedicated and passionate in his efforts to improve the on-field performance of the Texas Rangers, and it is greatly appreciated. He has represented the organization with class and dignity. We have had extensive discussions over the last several weeks. While the team's current performance is certainly a big part of the discussion, we also are looking at the future. As the Rangers continue to develop a winning culture and put the pieces together to compete for the postseason year in and year out, we felt a change of leadership was necessary at this time. On behalf of the entire Texas Rangers organization, we thank Chris and wish him and his family the very best." End quote. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. There is a lot of factoring in this season performance, which at times has been incredibly frustrating. There have been some really good moments. There was that month of May where the Rangers just went on a tear and looked like, okay, that entire terrible month of April where they went 7-14, they went 17-10 against incredibly difficult competition in the month of May. June was much more frustrating, but they were still about 500, 12-14. Then July. I think July is really what sunk this. The Rangers went 10-17 in the month of July, and it was just such a rough go of it for them in a lot of games that, should have been winnable. A bunch of really close losses, a bunch of frustrating games, and including that 3-game sweep in Baltimore where the Rangers lost 3 straight one-run games, and that was just a huge nail in the coffin for Chris Woodward. He has done a fairly decent job. He took over in 2019. He has managed some of the worst Rangers teams in definitely in recent history, but even in franchise history. And a lot of that was not his fault. There's only so much you can do as a manager. I think nowadays the manager gets too much credit and too much blame. Nowadays, it's not as much what he is doing on the field as it was, back in the day. Bullpen decisions, starting lineup decisions, things like that. That is a organization-wide decision at this point for the most part. I mean, there's a little bit of leeway with the manager being able to choose the lineup and who's going to hit second versus third or whatever. But like for the most part, it is a lot of times dictated from the front office. It is not just one person's job and he gets all the blame or all the credit when things go wrong. Same with a lot of bullpen decisions. There's some, pre-planned situations where they're going to use this person on this many days rest versus they've thrown this many pitches yesterday and we're going to bring him in, or this is what the matchup dictates. It's not as cut and dry as it was many years ago. And I still think people haven't realized that and haven't adjusted how much they're blaming managers for things that go right and things that go wrong. And this was just not a great place that he was put in when the Rangers started. It was time to move on from Jeff Bannister at the end of 2018. The time that he was coming in was right after Adrian Beltre retired. He came in 2019. The Rangers had a really good season for what they had that year. There was not a whole lot there in the cabinet, and he was able to pull out a team that was mostly in contention for that season. It was a lot better than the sum of their parts. And I think a lot of that had to do with Chris Woodward. One of the things that I really loved about him, players loved about him, that the media loved about him, is that he was very open and honest and not full of it. He would tell you straight up what he was thinking. He had times where he grew, times where he messed up, times where he owned it. And this was his first managerial job. This is the first time that he has done it at the big league level. And the Rangers gave him a lot of leeway and a lot shorter leeway in times where I thought that it was called for having more of a little bit of a longer leash this year. This was not going to be the year that the Rangers made the playoffs. It just wasn't. Teams do not go from 100 losses to 100 wins or anywhere near it, hardly ever. The Twins did it a few years back, but that's because they had horrendous injury luck and had talent on the roster already. They did make some key additions over the offseason and had a little bit of an overperforming of their luck a few years back when they did it, but that is such the rare outcome. The Rangers were every bit a 100-loss team last year, and adding Marcus Semien and Corey Seager was amazing. Adding John Gray was a great addition. Adding Martin Perez, huge addition. But 4 players cannot turn around an entire Major League Baseball club. Coming up, we're going to get into why this firing makes sense, and a little bit later, what the Rangers wanted from him and why he couldn't provide it. But first, this episode is brought to you by Built Bar. If you haven't tried the Built Bar Puffs yet, you are depriving yourself of one of life's greatest joys. And guess what? There's a new flavor. Are you ready? It's delicious, indulgent cookie dough covered in chocolate. That's right. Built has done it again. I started my day off with one of these Built Bars this morning. It was absolutely delicious. I'm eating cookie dough. It's covered in chocolate, but somehow it's good for me. I don't know how Built Bar does it. They must be using some weird mystical science or magic, but I don't know how they do it, but they just do it. Those cookie dough chunk puffs, they're only 160 calories and they have a whopping 15 grams of protein in it. They are delicious and they are made of collagen protein, which your body absorbs more naturally. They are delicious. They are good for you. Go get yourself a box of cookie dough chunk puffs. They are delicious and you will not regret it. I promise. And if you do, go to built.com, use promo code LOCKEDON15, get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. Now, as frustrating as this is for me, and I really did like Chris Woodward, and I'm very sad that I'm not going to be able to do the reading Chris Woodward quotes as Ted Lasso bit anymore. There is a part of me that understands this. There is a very logical reason, and that reason is the Rangers are a historically bad record in these one-run games. It is absolutely horrendous, and while it might not be Chris Woodward's fault, someone has got to take the blame in it, and it seems like Chris Woodward is falling on the sword. Texas is 6-24 in one-run games. 6-24. Now, the Rangers have not the greatest pen in the world, but it's not terrible. And when the Rangers had that huge, great stroke of luck in one-run games in 2015 and overachieved a little bit, it wasn't nearly the exact inverse of this. They were like, I think, 5 or 6 games above 500 in one-run games, where normally most teams are about 500. Usually you split some, and that's the deal. I mean, Dennis Santana has been rough as of late, but he has been hurt in the month of July. He kind of fell off a cliff. Same as for Brett Martin, but he's still been solid. The Rangers traded away Matt Bush. Matt Moore has been solid. By the way, congratulations to Matt Moore, who is on the paternity list. He is bringing another child in his world, and that is a really great thing for him. And by the way, Yeri Rodriguez has been called up. He has not made his major league debut yesterday when he first got on the big league roster, but I imagine by the end of the season, the Rangers will want to take a look at him. But Texas has been bad in these close games, and as much as he is beloved in the clubhouse by his team, by the front office, talked very highly about him. The beat writers absolutely love talking to him and think the world of him, but at a certain point, and the Rangers are not as bad as their record indicates, but a move has to be made. There has to be some kind of sacrificial lamb scapegoat, and at this point, it's Chris Woodward, and that sucks, and it's frustrating, but also there's a reason that they're doing it. Next year is the hard deadline. We have to compete next year. We have to be going all out. We must be in the thick of the playoff race. We cannot afford to be where we are next year. And the Rangers, I feel like they're going to be incredibly aggressive in the offseason yet again. Now, I don't think they're going to spend $500 million, but I think they're going to make a lot of trades. They're going to be going after some of these guys. They have got to get a top of the rotation pitcher. They have got to extend Martin Perez. I heard the number on the Tickets baseball podcast being thrown out of 4 years, $60 million for an extension for Martin Perez. They need to do that. I think that's reasonable, and you can absolutely live with it with what he's done this year and what he's meant to the club on and off the field. And the Rangers need probably 2 more starting pitchers after that, so you can have a rotation of question mark, Martin Perez, John Gray, and Dane Dunning. If Dane Dunning is your number 5, you feel really good about that. You can count on him to go out there every 5th day. But right now, the Rangers rotation, there's not a whole lot there. And even though it's not Chris Woodward's fault entirely that this team is underperforming, the Rangers might just need a different voice, because at a certain point, he has been the manager on losing teams. When they brought him in, they knew this was going to be a rebuild. They wanted to give him a look and see what he could do. And I think the frustrating part is that we haven't really seen him with the team that has playoff ability. We really haven't. But at a certain point, if he keeps being the manager, if you have the same manager when you've got a, lousy roster, and it's the same voice as when you have a better roster, sometimes no matter how great the things he's saying are, no matter what the actions he's doing are, those words can fall hollow. Like, they can just not have the same meaning that they should. And it's not his fault, and it's not really the front office fault. It's just kind of what it is. And I think it sucks that he got the short end of the stick on this deal. The Rangers did well in 2020. They had some moments there. They completely fell off a cliff. It has been exactly 2 years to the day the last time the Rangers were above 500. On August 15th in 2020, the Rangers beat Colorado 10-9. Then they would lose to Colorado. That would start a very long losing streak. 8 games, actually. And in the middle of that, the Rangers got swept with those 4 grand slams against the Padres, and Woody's ignorant comments that he had later learned from and got better from, but still started the Rangers down the path where they had to sell some guys off in 2020. In 2021, there was no hope. There was no hope that this team was going to be good. There was just not a good roster. They made trades. They sold off a lot of players, and they knew that was the first year they finally leaned into the rebuild. Because even heading into 2020, 2019, most of the start of it was a little bit of smoke and mirrors, but there were some positive developments. Joey Gallo was one of the best players in all of baseball through 70 games before he got hurt. He came back a little bit in August, but ended up not making a difference. Hunter Pence was incredibly solid, was an all-star for them that year, but fell short. And Danny Santana had some moments that year, and the top of your rotation was Mike Minor and Lance Lynn, both of whom had 7+ WAR seasons, nearly 8 WAR seasons. Mike Minor had a 7.9 Baseball Reference WAR season in 2019, and Lance Lynn had a 7.7 Baseball Reference WAR season that year. Both those guys were fantastic, but outside of that, Ariel Gerardo was the the pitcher with the next most games started for the Rangers that year, and he had a 5.81 ERA, 18 starts, 122 innings. It just was not a lot there, but Chris Woodward made it work. The bullpen of the top 4 guys, none of them had an ERA under 4. Only Chris Martin did, and I believe he got traded at midseason that year, a 3.08 ERA. But it's just, I don't know how that team won as many games as they did. But as much as I talked about overrating some of what the manager does, I do think Chris Woodward had a big part of it that year. Now, 2020, there were some hopes and dreams, and maybe they were a little overinflated, but they did at least perform well for the first 15 games of that very short season, which equates to a quarter of the season, until things really went in the tank and the Rangers finally embraced the rebuild, probably a couple years too late. Coming up, we're going to look at what else the Rangers wanted him to do, what are some of the things that he did well, and what it means now. But first, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. Find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every single league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, and combat sports, esports, even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have got you covered. If you want to take a bet on who the Rangers' next manager is going to be, I don't think they have odds up on that just yet, but you could take a bet there if you want to bet on the Rangers winning the game after they fired Chris Woodward because they're so pissed off because they love their manager. Or if you are going to bet that they're going to lose to the A's tonight because they are so distraught that they have fired their manager, you can go to betonline.net, because BetOnline is where the game starts. Now, what else did the Rangers want from Chris Woodward? Honestly, I am not sure. What else could he have done with this roster? Let's think about where this team started in 2019. They had 2 starting pitchers. They had Jeff Mathis catching every day for them, and they have traded away so much of that roster. Gone from that team is basically everybody. Everybody on that starting roster. Actually, let's see. The only people who are still in the organization, position player-wise, are Nick Solak. That's it. That is all that is left of that starting of those position players. And if you look at the pitching side, there's really not much left from that either. It's pretty much, let's see, Brock Burke, Colby Allard, Jose Leclerc, and I want to say, Jonathan Hernandez. That's it. That is all that is left of that team from when he started. A team that ended up finishing with a 78-84 record, decently out of contention, but was still above 500 all the way. The Rangers were 58-54 on August 5th, and that was before, I think Joey Gallo had just come back and he was right about to go back on the IL, and right before things kind of fell off a cliff. I mean, it was really rough right after the All-Star game there. I mean, the Rangers at the All-Star break were, 48-42. So 6 games above 500 heading in the All-Star break. And then the Rangers had a pretty darn bad losing streak right out of the All-Star break. They won a couple of games in Houston, but just absolutely fell right off after that. In 2020, there was a lot of false hope there. The Rangers traded for Corey Kluber. They thought they were getting a Cy Young winner, and they got an inning, a scoreless inning, but 1 inning out of a guy who they ended up trading, Emmanuel Clase, one of the best relievers in all of freaking baseball, throwing 102-mile-an-hour cutters. They had Jonathan Hernandez come on, and he was fantastic. Rafael Montero figured out how to pitch really well. Kyle Gibson had a decent back half of the season. But the starting pitching rotation was Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson, Jordan Lyles, Mike Minor. They got a lot of Colby Allard in there, which was not really a great thing. And the starting lineup was just, they could not hit. It was literally Joey Gallo and friends. And even Joey Gallo had an awful year that year. Ronald Guzman had a 750 OPS, and of the guys who started primarily at their position, nobody else had a higher OPS than him. It was just an awful offensive season. Nobody was quite right. IKF had a 2 WAR Joey Gallo had a 1.6 WAR. Leody Taveras came in and played 30 games and was the fourth most valuable player for the Rangers. Kyle Cody pitched in 5 games and was the fifth most valuable player. No, 8 games. He started 5 games, pitched in 8 games. 22 and a third and 2/3 innings, and he was the fifth most valuable player on that team. That was a completely terrible team with some hopes of Lance Lynn being amazing. He was, with some hopes of the Cy Young winner. At the time, the trade made sense, and you thought, okay, well, the only way this doesn't make sense is if his arm falls off. And well, his arm kind of fell off, and he didn't do anything for the Rangers. Mike Minor completely regressed after that. Kyle Gibson was decent in the back half of that season and showed some real promise in the front half of the 2021 season. But even that year was just pretty darn awful as well. They traded Gallo at midseason. They had one of the worst catching duos in all of baseball, and then somehow both of them became all-stars the very next year. They had IKF, who was providing a lot of value defensively, but not a whole lot at the plate. They traded Kyle Gibson. They have traded away Lance Lynn. They traded away Mike Meyer, Gallo. They've lost all of these guys. And how do you expect this guy to contend? Yes, the roster is much better than last year, but still, the starting pitching rotation, there's just not that much there. There's just not enough there to have a winning record. I mean, Martin Perez has been fantastic. Dunning has been solid, exactly what the Rangers asked him to be, pretty decent fourth, fifth starter. Go out there every day, give you at least 5 innings. Sometimes he'll go out there and give you 7 and look absolutely nasty. John Gray has had some stints, but he's also had some injury problems. Taylor Hearn and Spencer Howard have just not been anywhere close to what the Rangers thought they could be. And Brock Burke has been a revelation, but for the most part, this is about where the Rangers should be. They're going to be better than last year by a decent margin. They added these 2 guys. It was a real rough go at the start for Marcus Semien, but he's at 2.6 WAR for the season. Probably going to end up with a 3 or maybe 4 win player, which is solid, about what you're asking for him. Corey Seager's at 3.6 WAR this year. Adolis Garcia has kind of proven that last year wasn't completely out of the blue. One of the only bright spots from last year was Adolis Garcia. But still, even Nathaniel Lowe is ticking up a little bit this year. But still, they are not there yet. They are not a contending team yet, and they are behaving like they should be. Chris Woodward also helped them get the biggest free agent signing since Alex Rodriguez. Now, I know Adrian Beltre is the best free agent signing in recent Rangers history, at least this century. But at the time, he wasn't anything like A-Rod, and I think Corey Seager definitely had more hype on him at the moment. He was a lot younger than Beltre, and he had a lot of promise as well, and they didn't give Adrian Beltre a 10-year, $325 million contract, even though he absolutely would have deserved it. Maybe not at the time, but in retrospect, I would have been very happy with an Adrian Beltre 10-year, $325 million contract, I should say. But the timing just does not make sense. You already know you're not going to make a playoff spot. It's just not going to happen unless the Rangers win like 20 games in a row or whatever. And unless they really want Tony Beasley to be their next manager, which, by the way, I would be all for, because I freaking love Tony Beasley. Everybody in the organization loves Tony Beasley. He is the longest tenured coach there with the organization, been there for forever. But I just don't know why the timing makes sense now. I feel like you at least give him through the end of the season. He helped you get Seager. Seager loves him. So, like, literally all of his players pretty much love him and say nothing but great things about him. And you're not going to learn that much about whatever manager you do hire in the interim, aka Tony Beasley, it seems like, throughout for the next, 6 weeks that's left in the season. I just don't get it. They are acting like the front office, it seems like, it's acting like they're going to be fired next year if they don't make the playoffs. That's kind of what this move feels like. Now, I don't think that should necessarily be the case, especially if they have an above 500 season and they're at least within like a couple games of the playoffs, which I think they will be next year. But they're going to have to make some incredibly dramatic moves this offseason. Like, go out and pay Jacob deGrom like $200 million for like 4 years or something. Like, it's going to have to be absolutely insane money that the Rangers throw around and trade for like Pablo Lopez or like Sandy Alcantara, and trade like a crap ton of prospect capital to go do that. That is the kind of moves that it seems like they're going to have to be making this offseason, because this rebuild was was way too late when they decided to rebuild. It was literally halfway through 2020. They're like, oh, okay, we can't keep tricking ourselves with these smoke and mirrors. We need to actually embrace this rebuild, which, to be honest, as much as I love 2019 and my first year on the podcast being a fun, feisty, competitive year, that might have been the year to start selling off. It was definitely felt like the year to go trade off Lance Lynn or Mike Minor, because you knew, especially with the Gallo injury and some injuries in the cracks in 2019 with Hunter Pence, like, this is not going to last forever. Maybe they sort of started kicking the tire. They definitely should have started kicking the tires on Danny Santana, who didn't come anywhere near that much value later on in the year. Maybe they should have thought about trading Shin-Soo Choo, which is much people bitch about what he was doing. He had an 826 OPS that year, which was 9% better than league average DHs. He had 24 home runs that year. Like, he was a very, very solid player with a 371 on base. That is what he did. He hit about 20 to 25 homers and had an on base above 350. That is a good, valuable player, even if they are just DHing. Like, in hindsight, and even at the moment, it kind of felt like, okay, this is a fun little run with the injuries, trade everybody off, build around Gallo and Mazzara and Odor at that point, because Odor was just 25 and he had his moments. Maybe even should have sold high on Odor then. I don't know. But the splashing around 500 in the first part of 2020 was rough. It was really rough, especially with 2018 was so tough as well. Maybe even heading into the 2019 season. Adrian Beltre retired. That was a perfect time to just tear everything down and be like, okay, we're going to start the rebuild now. It's going to be painful, even though they knew that new stadium was probably going to open in 2020. And how could they have known that the pandemic was going to happen? But in hindsight, it seemed like that was the time to start the rebuild. And then right about now, you'd have some more prospects that are coming up through the ranks that will, at this point, would have been here for about a year, and you would have seen a little bit more of them. So it would have been more realistic last year when they spent that $500 million. There would have been a little bit more of a baseline to build from, because coming into this year, I mean, last year, there was not a whole lot there that you wanted to say, okay, this is a player that I think can stick around. At that point, it didn't seem like Jonah Heim was going to be an everyday player. He's proven me wrong, and he's been great this year. Daniel Lowe is still a question with him. It was like, okay, he is really bad defensively. Is his offense going to be good enough to offset it? It seems like, yes, that is the case. He is going to be good enough to be an everyday starting first baseman. The rest of the guys on that roster, position player wise, there was not a whole lot there. Dane Dunning showed, all right, he can be fine as a starting pitcher. But other than that, there just really was not a whole lot else there. And so I think it's more of a collective organizational failure that Chris Woodward is bearing the brunt of, which is really frustrating. But I understand it, and it felt like it was probably going to happen at the end of the season. Would it have been better to just let him ride it out throughout the end of the season, see if they can catch a hot streak and maybe show, hey, I think I've got something there. But in terms of the talent he's had in 4 seasons here, there's not been a roster. This is the closest roster he's had to a 500 club. The rest of the clubs that he's had, the talent was not there. They overperformed in 2019. They underperformed this year. They performed about as well as you could have expected last year with how terrible that roster was for the vast majority of the season, especially after the All-Star break, once they traded away Gibson and Gallo, the only players that were performing decently well besides Adolis Garcia. And even the back half, once they were gone, it was literally just pretty much nobody. And nobody was really performing well in the back half of last season. And it was some of the roughest Rangers baseball that I have ever had the displeasure of watching. But I'm going to miss Chris Woodward. I think he will land on his feet. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was the manager of, say, the Toronto Blue Jays next year, who are looking for a full-time manager. Depending on how they finish the season, they do have an interim manager. They also fired their skipper midseason. But this is a sign that the Rangers are going to very heavily go for it, must go for it. Absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts about being in the playoffs next year, or heads are going to roll more than Chris Woodward's already has. And that's a little scary and also a little exciting as a Rangers fan to say, all right, they are really showing you that they're putting their money where their mouth is and making decisions like they need to be contending, because this Rangers record is much worse than it should be. But still, it's a frustrating time to fire a manager as beloved as Chris Woodward. That's going to do it for today's show. Thank you all so much for listening to, if you listen to 2 shows today, if you listen to the one show I put out in the 2 hours between then and Chris Woodward being fired, God bless you if you listen to the other one. If you haven't listened to it today, go check it out. Pretty solid recap of the weekend that had a rally bird that could not save Chris Woodward. Also, go check out Locked On MLB, Paul Francis Sullivan. He is a baseball encyclopedia. He will take you through baseball, MLB of the past, present, and future. Go check it out wherever you get your podcast. Thank y'all so much for listening and subscribing. And until next time, don't forget to enjoy baseball.